And Jimmy says, well, look, I don't know what to say. I had this big speech, but just let me tell you, I'm Danny Sheehan's best friend from Harvard Divinity School, and he's at the Jesuit headquarters, and we're trying to get you guys to respond to cutting back. We're going to get the U.S. to cut back 10% of their missiles, and you've got to do the same thing. And Gorbachev says, the U.S. will never do that, he said. The U.S. will never do that because they believe they need the warheads. Not against us, not against Russia. China, he said. China showed the U.S. in the Korean War that they could field 1 billion men in uniform. And there's nothing the United States can do to stop them. And so they believe they need to have nuclear weapons. And so they will not take this initiative. So I'm going to have to do this. When I become president, he said, I will reduce our nuclear missiles unilaterally, and you get the United States to respond. He said, but when I do that, they will come for me in the nighttime. They'll come for me in the night, he said. And so you have to agree to become the president of a Gorbachev Foundation dedicated to ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And at that point, Jim Garrison, my best friend from Harvard Divinity School, became the president of the Gorbachev Foundation and was given a full city block in Moscow, where the center was set up to carry out all of that activity. And when Gorbachev became the head of the party and the president, he began glasnost in perestroika and began working steadily toward trying to do this, and started to unilaterally cut back on nuclear missiles, reached out to the United States to try to get this to happen. And that whole process went on all the way up through into December 31st of 1991. Okay, in which he gradually did this. And as you know, as you remember, they did come for him in the night, or you don't remember probably, because it was, well, you kids were still like in junior high school, I guess. You know, but the KGB people came for Gorbachev in the night, the GRU, and they kidnapped him and took him away. But there was such a huge international row about this that it shamed them all, and they had to come back and bring him back. And he came back, he completed the process. He extracted an agreement at that time from George H.W. Bush and James Baker III, that his Secretary of State. They promised that if Gorbachev would sign the releasing all of the republics from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they could become their own independent republics, that the United States would never attempt to recruit any of those republics to become members of NATO. And they would place no missiles in those republics. Okay? So Gorbachev went ahead and did this, signed the release on December 31st of 1991. And that following Monday morning, now I've told you this quickly in the past, but I want you to remember this. And so I'll take the risk of boring you by repeating what it is that happened then, because it is so crucial for you to understand what's happening at the root here of this impeachment confrontation that you're going to be seeing. What happened is that on the Monday morning after the dissolution, voluntary dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 31st of 1991, the Defense Department people under Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush Sr., that they gathered in the West Wing of the White House, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, David Addington, Scooter Libby, Doug Fife, Elliott Abrams were all there. And they sat down and they put together the 1992, now remember this is January, first week of January of 1992, the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And in that document, they proposed that, and I've said this to you before, but that they expected to be hit with this huge wave of citizens and politicians and everybody insisting that now that the Soviet Union had finally dissolved itself and stepped back away from the Cold War, and that the United States had been using as a justification for their 500 to 700 billion dollar a year military budget. They've been using this canard that the Soviet Union was planning to invade, the United States over the polar ice caps, and take over all of Europe and everywhere. And so that now that they had stepped back voluntarily from the Cold War, that they were going to get all this pressure to cut back on the national military budget. And he said, we have to face that and face them down and say, no, this is the time to increase the military budget so that we can establish full spectrum dominance over the entire planet. In every single nation, in every single square inch of the planet, even inside the territory of other governments, that we can defeat them inside their own homeland. And this is what we need to do. And they laid that out. And this has to be done unilaterally by the United States, that we have to insist that all the NATO countries are on board this. We need to have the right to supply all the military equipment to all the NATO members, so that we have to get uniform weaponry. They have to use our F-18s or whatever they were at the time, F-14s, I guess, at that time. They have to use all of our over-the-horizon radar. They have to use our AWACS. They have to buy all of that stuff from the United States, okay? And we are going to establish full spectrum dominance over the planet. Now, they put that forward, and in April of 1992, they circulated this first draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document to a select number of members of the cabinet and to a select few general officers in the Pentagon. Someone leaked a copy of it to the Washington Post. And the Washington Post published this aggressive editorial against it, characterizing it, not coincidentally, as a return to the robber baron era, as a return to gunboat diplomacy and the manifest destiny. Now, that was quite sage at the time for doing it, because that's exactly what that was. Because what it was is the Soviet Union that had come into existence in October of 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution had been in place challenging the doctrine of manifest destiny, the doctrine of imperialism, Western imperialism on the part of the United States and the European countries itself. And they were in existence from 1917 all the way till December 31st of 1991. So as soon as they withdrew from the field, being the antithesis to the thesis of Caucasian, nation-state-based capitalist imperialism. Flat out. I mean, it's not even being ideological. I mean, that's exactly what it was during the robber baron era. It was totally white men. It was all capitalist. It was all imperialist. The doctrine of manifest destiny and the white man's burden was just flagrant. I mean, they weren't even trying to pretend it wasn't true. And so that they returned right to that basic concept. And the New York Times followed it on the following Sunday in the Sunday New York Times with another editorial condemning it. And so George Bush Sr. issued a public statement saying, look, we don't acknowledge that there is any such planning document. But even if there were, it would only be a draft. And therefore, there'll be another draft of it if there were one. And so what he sits down and does, he sits down with Theodore G. Shackley, who was the ADDO, the Associate Deputy Director for Operations of the Central Intelligence Agency under George H.W. Bush, when George H.W. Bush was the CIA Director under Gerald Ford, back from 1974 to 1977. And Theodore Shackley was the Director of Covert Operations worldwide for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Bush Sr. And now what happened is that when George Bush Sr. was president of the United States and the Soviet Union had now voluntarily dissolved, in their first iteration of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document had been exposed for what it was, blatant return to gunboat diplomacy and world imperialism, that what they did is they drafted a second iteration of that document. And in this document, they proposed doing the same thing, but not unilaterally on behalf of the United States exclusively. They said that what they wanted to do is they wanted to establish a new alliance. They wanted to establish a new alliance, and in this alliance was going to be the United States, Canada, Mexico, not the Mexican indigenous people, but the PRI, which is the Spanish Castilian, the Castilian Spanish political party in Mexico, and the UK, and France, and Italy, and the new reunified Germany. And now I want you to listen. And Russia, if they will choose to become part of this, now that they have spun off all of their ethnic provinces. And this will be called the new Northern Industrial Alliance. And the objective of this will be to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by the member states of the new Northern Industrial Alliance. And this is all in confrontation with China, the new rising empire, the new rising Asian empire. And you will be well served to get a copy of and to read the work of a man by the name of Samuel P. Huntington. Samuel P. Huntington, at this point in time, we're talking now in April of 1992, he wrote a major article for Foreign Affairs magazine. And Foreign Affairs magazine is the official publication of the come on, I can pretend this is a test like I'm really testing you, but I don't. The Council on Foreign Relations, okay? It's the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he is the president of the American Academy of Political Science. And he is the chief professor of international relations at Harvard University. And he writes this major article called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. He follows up with a major book of the same title, expanding on that article. And in this article, he states that, look, China is going to be rising to power in the first half of the 21st century. And they're going to be reaching out and taking under their auspices all of Asia, including Japan and Korea and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. They're going to rise up into the ascendancy and assert control and dominion over all of Asia. And if we're going to be able to maintain our place of superiority on the planet, we're going to have to respond by overcoming all of this multi-ethnic kind of activity that we're engaged in right now. We're having all kinds of foreign people come into the country. We're having all kinds of racial groups come into the country. We're going to have to return to a Christian culture, and preferably Catholic, he said, because that's the root religion of Western civilization, and that we need to get rid of all of this multi-ethnic activity and return to this. And I want you to read the book. I want you to read the book. It's the Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel P. Huntington. You will find it hard to believe that a person of that stature, having that amount of influence, was saying the things that he was saying. But it is completely consistent with the second iteration of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And that the entire objective is to get access to the oil in Russia, and North America, including the Arctic shelf, and have that as the major source of energy for the Western civilization to be able to confront the rise of the Asian empire. And so that's what happened. And what happened is prior to the actual official dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 31st of 1991, what happened earlier in 1991 was in June of 1990, as soon as President George Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker Sr., that when he got word through the Central Intelligence Agency and other places that the Soviet Union was contemplating dissolving, that is Gorbachev, what he did, and I've told you this before, and it's extraordinarily important. What happened is that when that information came to him, he, George Bush Sr., wrote a handwritten memorandum to Saddam Hussein. In it, he said, I know that you are having trouble with Kuwait on your southern border, and you believe that they are slant drilling under your southern boundary of Iraq and stealing Iraqi oil. And I would very much like you to resolve that problem peacefully. But if you find that you cannot do so, I would like to let you know personally that I personally would not view that as contrary to the long-term best interests of the United States. And so, not surprisingly, Saddam Hussein, upon having been hand-delivered that memo from April Gillespie, who was the United States ambassador to Iraq at that time under the Bush administration, he read the note and immediately deployed 10,000 Iraqi military people to the southern border of Iraq, on the northern border of Kuwait. At which point, his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, reaches out and contacts Prince Bandar, who was the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia. And he brings Prince Bandar to the West Wing, and he invites him in, and Dick Cheney and his staff, that's Scooter Libby and Doug Fife and Wolfowitz and the others, show to Prince Bandar a real-time NSA satellite photographs of the assemblage of military people from Iraq on their southern border, on the northern border of Kuwait, and says, you see, we have direct aerial surveillance intelligence showing that, that Saddam Hussein from Iraq is getting ready to invade Kuwait. And we have equally reliable intelligence, United States intelligence, telling us that after they occupy Kuwait, they are going to go into Saudi Arabia and overthrow the House of Saud and take over Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Arabian oil fields. And so that what we want to do is, if in fact you come to believe that this is true, and you can convince King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah that this is getting ready to happen, we would like to invoke the secret 1972, August of 1972, secret treaty that was entered into by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger on their way back from their secret trip to China, when they were in the SR-71, the Blackbird stealth aircraft, and they on the way back from China, they landed in Saudi Arabia and went at that time and met with King Faisal. They met with Faisal and they entered into an agreement, a secret agreement, that would allow the West, the 7 sister oil corporations, the 7 sisters they call them, that are Aramco, the Arab American Oil Corporation, with British Petroleum and Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California and Royal Dutch Shell and Exxon, or Esso at that time, that they would get a renewed lease for 60 more years, an exclusive lease on all of the oil wells in Saudi Arabia. And they would agree to allow Saudi Arabia to increase the amount of money they get, the royal family gets, for every gallon of gas sold from their oil fields, instead of getting 42 cents a gallon, they would get $1.42 a gallon. And they had to agree, pursuant to this secret agreement in August of 1972, that they would use that extra $1 a gallon at the pump to purchase military equipment only from the United States military manufacturers, specifically the AWACS airborne radar, the over-the-horizon radar that they have, ground radar, weapons, etc., that they would buy them only from the United States using that extra $1. Secondly, they would use portions of that extra $1 a gallon at the pump to dredge out the harbors of their country and to build major military bases for taking American air transports and American troops into Saudi Arabia. And thirdly, they would have to agree that if, in fact, either Russia or China were to make a feint toward occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields, that Saudi Arabia would invite the United States to come in to protect the oil fields, and we would bring in our warships into those dredged out harbors and fly in our military transports and bring in our military people to protect the Middle Eastern oil fields. And so what they were saying was that what Dick Cheney was saying to Prince Bandar now in June of 1990, he was saying, look, we believe that Saddam Hussein is getting ready to not only invade Kuwait, but he's going to come into Saudi Arabia and overthrow you guys, that we would like to have you, if it turns out to be true, if you see that he invades Kuwait like we say he's going to, then you should believe us that he's going to come into Saudi Arabia like we're telling you. And we would like to invoke the 1972 treaty and have Saudi Arabia invite us in for our warships and our military troops to come in to protect the oil fields against Saddam Hussein. Okay? And so that then Prince Bandar goes back to Saudi Arabia, tells King Farouk and Crown Prince Abdullah about this, and sure enough, that Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait and occupies it. And so right away, Dick Cheney flies to Saudi Arabia and meets with King Farouk and Crown Prince Abdullah and invokes the 1972 treaty and says, I'd like to have you invite us to come in. Okay, he's there at the castle, and then he leaves to let them think about it. And I told you before that Turki bin Faisal, who is the son of King Faisal, who had entered into the 1972 agreement, who then got assassinated while Faisal was still a kid, and so he couldn't become king. And so Faisal's older brother, Farouk, younger brother, became the king. So that Turki bin Faisal, who is now the chief of security for the entire House of Saud, comes into King Farouk and Crown Prince Abdullah, and he says, no, I know what's going on here. I know that Cheney is here trying to invoke that old 1972 treaty. I don't want you to do that as the chief of security. I have an alternative. There's another way that we can protect ourselves against Saddam Hussein. Give me a chance to come in at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning and have a meeting with you about this. Do not make any decision on the proposal from Cheney. The next morning, in comes Turki bin Faisal, the chief of security for the House of Saud, and he brings with him Mohammed Baroum, who is the heir to the wealthiest family in all of Saudi Arabia, that in fact not only have income from the oil, but also made money dredging out the harbors and building military bases because they own all of the concrete and steel mills and stuff in Saudi Arabia. And so he brings in Mohammed Baroum, and he brings in with him also Khalil Mahfouz. Khalil Mahfouz is the head of the Royal Saudi Family Bank. And they come in along with Turki bin Faisal, and the three of them implore King Farouk and Crown Prince Abdullah to reject the offer that's being made, or the solicitation actually that's being made by Dick Cheney, and says, look, we have an option, another alternative by means of which we can protect our country against Saddam Hussein. And they go and open the door, and in walks Osama bin Laden. And I told you this before. It's Osama bin Laden, who turns out to be the best boyhood friend of Turki bin Faisal since they were 4 years old together. And he comes in and says, look, I can drive Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. He'll never try to come into Saudi Arabia. I'll drive him back up into Iraq. I've got 10,000 battle-hardened troops that are up in the Khyber Pass right now. They're sitting there, Mujahideen troops that have just gotten through kicking the crap out of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Okay, so I've got all these troops ready to go, and he spends like an hour and a half with charts and everything showing how he will come down and drive Saddam Hussein out. He says, so do not invite the infidels into the Holy Land, he said, because they will stay. They will come in and stay. So do not do this. And so they then leave. And so Dick Cheney, who is still there at the palace, finds out about this meeting, and he comes back for a second bite at the apple. And he comes back in and he says to King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah, look, we're going to sweeten this deal. We will agree if you will invite us in to drive Saddam Hussein out of here. We'll agree not only to drive Saddam Hussein out and protect you against Saddam Hussein, we'll protect you against your own people because your own people hate you. Because the fact of the matter is that all with your 400 princes running all over the world, losing $1 million at the throw of a dice in Monte Carlo and whoring all around Europe and driving 16 Mercedes-Benz of different colors depending on how they feel, they despise you. And that they're fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, and they hate the lifestyle. And so we'll come in and protect you against your own people if they try to rise up against you. And that was it. And so King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah agree to this. They invite the United States to come in to drive Saddam Hussein out after a camouflage job of recruiting the what they call them, the willing, the alliance of the willing, which I think included New Zealand and probably Zambia or somebody. There's a small handful of other people, but it was a full-scale United States military invasion. This is the first Gulf War, as they call it. And in they came in and drove Saddam Hussein out. Saddam Hussein, all they did is fled. They fled completely out of Kuwait, and there was this horrible scene where they were carpet bombing them in their retreat, just killing them by the hundreds and thousands when they were just running away. And then they set up a no-fly zone because they're not going to depose Saddam Hussein from power. They're only going to push him back into Iraq, and they're going to set up a no-fly zone so that they can't come back down. And it's going to take 250,000 full-time U.S. military personnel permanently based in the Holy Land to control that area. And that is how jihad started. That is why Osama bin Laden was one of the leaders of the jihad to try to drive those troops out of there. And that's what he was doing. And they bombed the barracks, in Beirut. They blew up the U.S. embassies in Africa. They attacked the USS Cole in Yemen. And they were engaging in these kind of guerrilla-type tactics against this huge military power, occupying military power of the United States. And that's how it began. That's how jihad began. And so what happened is the United States, when the Soviet Union stepped back out of the Cold War on December 31st of 1991, in order to rationalize the continued buildup of the U.S. military, they started saying that, they were getting set to be attacked by terrorists in the Middle East, because they didn't like our lifestyle. Right? I mean, here we got 250,000 full-time military personnel right in the Holy Land, occupying the Holy Land, swaggering around in full body armor and running over children in the street, with their war machines, etc. And they're pretending that the people are attacking us because they don't like our lifestyle. And that's how it started. And so what we're dealing with here is oil. We're dealing with the attempt on the part of the United States and the European nations, all part of this new Northern Industrial Alliance, to bring Russia into the alliance. Okay? But it's the Republican Party that was doing it, not the Democrats. It was George Bush Sr. and Dick Cheney and then George Bush Jr. that went in and completed the deal in the second Gulf War, making up a complete line of bullshit about how Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons and was going to be attacking the United States and sending his delegates out to the Sunday talk shows, how, oh, you know, if we don't go in there right now, we're going to be finding New York City under a mushroom cloud. You know, just complete unabrogated lie. They go in shock and awe, and they go in the Second Gulf War and massacre the people in Iraq and flatten the whole place, you know, and that they go into Afghanistan. And they go into Afghanistan because they got through negotiating. I won't open up a whole new topic, but they spent months negotiating with the Taliban, trying to get the Taliban to agree to allow a pipeline to be built from the Caspian Sea all the way down through to Turkestan, down through Afghanistan, down to the Arabian Sea. So they could pump out the oil from under the Black Sea and the natural gas from under the Caspian Sea, and the oil, these 84 or 87 billion barrels of oil from the Arctic shelf. And if the Taliban had agreed to allow them to do that, they would have left them in, just like they're negotiating with the Taliban now. They were negotiating with the Taliban then. They didn't care that they cut women's lips off because they wore lipstick, or, you know, they beat them in the streets for seeing their ankle. They didn't care about any of that stuff. They were willing to negotiate with the Taliban as long as the Taliban would have allowed them to build the pipeline. And it turns out that the major, I'll say this in closing, the group that was negotiating to build the pipeline was called the Carlyle Group. And the Carlyle Group was made up of George Bush Sr., George W., Frank Carlucci, and James Baker III. Okay, and their cohorts. And the guy who was their principal negotiator was a guy by the name of Richard V. Secord, who was in fact the guy from the Iran-Contra thing who ran the illegal Air Force for the Enterprise. Okay, so what I'm saying is that you're dealing with a cadre of hardcore right-wing people in the Republican Party that believe in the full spectrum dominance of American power. Okay, and their fallback position is that this will be done just by all the white people. Not just the U.S., but by all the white people. You know, Canada and the Castilian Spanish, and the U.K. and Italy and Russia, now that they have spun off all of their ethnic provinces. So the bottom line is you need to know who you're dealing with. And this is what's going on in the love relationship between Donald Trump, who is a complete imbecilic reductionist. And all he does is say, wait a second, we're supposed to be friends with Russia. We're supposed to be having an oil deal with Russia. So why shouldn't I have the Exxon CEO be the Secretary of State? And why shouldn't I have a full oil cabinet? You know, and why shouldn't I have a national security advisory team that's filled with people that are all got connections to Russia? You know, I mean, every single one of them. There's the chart. You know, here's the chart of all the different people that were his contacts. There they are. All of them with direct contacts to Russia. So he's saying to himself, what are you doing to me? I'm only doing what you guys wanted to do. You know, just like I banned all Muslims, and just like I figure out we don't give any money to these shithole countries in Africa, you know, why should I continue to pretend that I'm not a blatant racist? You know, what's the problem here? Oh, that's Trump. You know, and here are all the other Republicans going, oh, gee, you know, I mean, this guy isn't getting the message here. You know, you're supposed to use dog whistles. You know, you're not supposed to be just braying, you know, like a horse in heat. You know, that's what he's doing. So what I'm saying is you need to know who we're dealing with here. You need to know what the secret is that's out behind the crime that they were engaged in, because Trump himself doesn't view it as a crime. He views it as carrying out the project, that whole project that they were involved in, the new North Alliance. That's right, the Northern Industrial Alliance. That's what he sees it as. So he's befuddled by why they're treating him like this. I mean, other than the fact that he's a boar in a horse's ass, which he doesn't get anyway. But so that they aren't going to impeach him for just being a horse's ass. So what they have to do is they have to try to figure out some narrative here that doesn't reveal this. They've got to figure out, the Democrats have to figure out some narrative to charge him with that doesn't reveal this. And that's going to be the challenge. That's going to be the challenge. Because the progressive Democrats aren't even in on the secret. And they think they're going to impeach him just because he's such a horse's ass. You know? And that apparently is not an impeachable offense. Okay, so that's where we are. I wanted to be able to tell you now that we've dug in a little deeper and figured out what's going on here. We'll come together again on Thursday, and I want to pick up on some more of the deep background information about why it is that this is what happens in these impeachments. Just like they never revealed in the Iran-Contra scandal what the real scandal was. They all kept saying, "Boy, this is really complicated. We can't figure out what's going on here." You know, so you know that Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor, he's indicted the first 6 people, and George Bush Sr. pardoned all of them at the direct advice of William Barr, so they wouldn't testify against Bush. Wouldn't testify against Bush for what? Same way with the Watergate burglary. You know, still to this day, what were they doing in the Watergate hotel? Why were they in there? Well, let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about the fact that he obstructed justice. When they were trying to investigate what happened in Watergate, they caught him asking the CIA to go in and get the FBI to shut down the investigation, and they impeached him for that, they say. Okay. None of that's true. None of that's true. So what we want to talk about on Thursday is what is true. You know, what were the secrets behind Watergate? What were the secrets behind Iran-Contra? So that you'll see that's a parallel of what the secret is here that's going on that neither one of the major political parties want to talk about. And yet the kind of unwashed masses and the intelligentsia in the community are all up in arms trying to get these people impeached. And they don't quite know whether to do it or not. Okay, so that's where we're at, and I hope it's not as nice a day on Thursday. And we'll have our full contingent here with us. Okay? Great. Thank you, you guys.
Back to New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett at CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. Our IQ scores dropping like flies. We've got that story, plus scared politicians get strapped. But first, peace is bad for business. War stocks plummet. After Trump-Kim summit, American defense contractors were practically drooling over the prospect of all-out war with North Korea as Trump was all fire and fury last year. But Tuesday's summit between Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un appears to have dampened war profiteers' dreams of yet another catastrophic U.S.-led military conflict, at least for now, demonstrating that even the slightest whiff of peace is enough to scare investors in America's most profitable military contractors, as Trump and Kim were signing a vague, non-binding agreement that's merely the first step towards a lasting diplomatic solution. Shares of Raytheon fell 2.6%, Lockheed Martin tumbled 1%, Northrop Grumman declined 1.3%, Boeing dipped 0.2%, and General Dynamics fell 1%. Financial analyst Brad McMillan said falling defense stocks represent investors' fear that the chance for a hot war between U.S. and North Korea, which he describes as one of the big potential growth stories recently, could be slipping away. If weapons are used, they need to be replaced. That makes war a growth story for these stocks. What the agreement between Trump and Kim does, at least for a while, is take military conflict off the table. But as Mint Press News notes, before we get all excited, let's remember that both fake sides in the U.S. Congress just passed a $717 billion War Pigs budget, much of which will pretty much go right back into the pockets of the aforementioned companies. James, there's a lot of different angles to discuss on the whole Trump-Kim summit, but I think this is a particularly telling one.
It is, but I wouldn't be crying tears in my beers for the military-industrial complex quite yet. And as, obviously, as Mint Press News notes there, yes, a new record-breaking War Pigs budget just being passed by the bipartisan monopoly, really, of power there in the United States. And it is true, it is absolutely true that the North Korea hype of the last several years has contributed greatly to the overall defense budgets here in the Asia-Pacific region. And Asia-Pacific, I think, has been the second highest growth of defense, overall defense spending. Defense, haha. Let's stop using the euphemisms. Offense spending in the entire world over the last several years, specifically, I think, because justified by the hype surrounding North Korea. I don't think it's actually justified, obviously, by North Korea, but they use everything as the carte blanche excuse. That's why South Korea and Japan are getting all dronized and getting all these anti-aircraft missile systems in place that, again, missile defense against North Korea, whereas, obviously, I think we know it's aimed at China and other places as well. So it's been that boogeyman that has been the convenient excuse for spending money like there's no tomorrow. So if you took that boogeyman out of the equation, it would be at least somewhat more difficult to justify some of this quote-unquote defense spending, but it will probably happen anyway. I mean, let's have no delusions about that. Secondly, this whole Trump-Kim deal statement, whatever it is very much in the eyes of the beholder, the perspective of the eyes of the beholder. For example, you might look at Peter Van Buren talking about how this is great, this can be a turning point, this is a new era of relations, blah, blah, blah. And contrast that with Daniel Larison, writing in The American Conservative. Read the Trump-Kim Memorandum, The Devil is in the Details, where he says you should actually read the statement itself that they signed and note that it has even less substance than was being expected in terms of any concrete details of anything, which is to be expected on one level. This is a leaders' summit that's happening before any concrete negotiations have happened. Of course, what are they going to come out with? No, clearly, they're just going to come out with some mealy-mouthed political let's work together statement that means absolutely nothing. So that's what it accomplished. It has, I mean, at any rate, it isn't fire and brimstone and we're going to nuke you to death kind of rhetoric, so yay. But, as Daniel Larison points out, this leaves a gigantic door open for the warmongers, the Boltons, and the other people we know already have and will continue to try to undermine any talk of peace on the Korean Peninsula. It leaves a gigantic barn door open for them to sabotage this non-deal, this whatever it is, this statement in so many different ways. So in the coming months, I mean, as if the neocons are just going to go, okay, oh well. I mean, obviously, this is just a big open door for them to start driving things through and, oh look, they didn't agree to this and this and this, therefore the deal's off, we gotta nuke them to death. So I don't think this is the end of the story by any means. It is the beginning. It's just a question of what kind of story will this become. And I'm not holding my breath that the military-industrial complex is just going to shrivel up and go away because of this.
I was talking a couple mornings ago on my morning show that the Council on Foreign Relations have pretty much also been pushing the idea that it doesn't really matter what comes out of this. The cyber attacks from North Korea are still going to continue. And interestingly enough, in my chat, I had more than a couple of folks saying they expect Kim Jong-un to basically get the Gaddafi treatment, as maybe they'll get the Libya treatment as well. So all of that remains to be seen. As we move to our second story this week on New World Next Week, episode 343 for June 14th, 2018. Politicians fear for safety as threats against Congress skyrocket. This via actually an original piece from the New York Post. Representative Barry Loudermilk of Georgia bought body armor. Representative Greg Harper hired armed security guards for events back home in Mississippi. And Representative Dan Donovan fortified his Brooklyn and Staten Island offices with security cameras and buzzer systems. This is the new normal for members of Congress. 1 year after the horrific congressional baseball shooting that almost took the life of Representative Steve Scalise, members are keenly aware that serving in public office has put a target on their backs. Interestingly enough, James, 1 year later, the GOP team will make a triumphant return to the charity baseball game on June 14th, pretty much as this goes to press at Nationals Park in the District of Criminals. But they claim that the threats against Congress have skyrocketed. In 2016, there were 902 threatening incidents and communications against members of Congress. By 2017, the reports had more than doubled to about 2,000, according to the House Sergeant at Arms office. In response, the House Administration Committee allocated $25,000 to each member in 2017 and again in 2018. No small amount. That's $25 million just printed out of thin air to beef up their personal and office security, prompting members to hire bodyguards for events and equip offices with panic buttons and shatter-resistant glass. In recognition of the threat level, the Federal Election Commission also ruled in July 2017 that lawmakers can also use campaign funds, those typically spent on TV propaganda ads and junk mail, to install security systems in their homes. And members of Congress aren't actually allowed to carry around their licensed concealed guns while in Washington, taking away one option to defend themselves. So, James, again, interestingly, this article, and it goes on and on and on. And again, everything that we say and play will always be included in the show notes, so you can continue the research and, again, read the documents for yourself. It comes originally from the New York Post, and I was pretty sure off the top of my head, I was like, oh, that's a Murdoch joint, right? I wanted to double check, and I hopped over to the Wikipedia page, and their Wikipedia page for the New York Post uses the front page of the New York Post from August 2017, the live televised murders of TV journalists Allison Parker and Adam Ward. I found it just an extra bit of kind of synchromistic threadaganda, if you will, on top of course, the constant hype of murder and mayhem. James, Congress getting strapped.
Yeah, well, if you are angry at the politicians and the things that they are affecting, yeah, I understand that on one level. But if you think violence against the Congress critters is the solution to anything, then you are playing this game all wrong. You don't understand what is happening. We've talked about it before. Politics is the Plato Cave allegory. You are watching the shadows on the wall, and that is the show that they want you to fixate on. Do not look behind you. Do not look at the people who are standing in front of the fire, moving the puppets around so that you can see this shadow play on the wall. This idea of getting angry at Congress or hurting Congress people is literally like punching the cave wall. It's not going to do anything except batter your own hand when, of course, they go, look at these violent protesters, these violent terrorists. We got to deal with them. Now we need more clampdown. That's all that would ever effectuate, and you will do nothing to the actual string pullers who are pulling these political puppet strings. That's the point of this. So, in fact, this actually works on a double level. Of course, if people do go crazy and start shooting up congressmen or whatever it is, then again, they can clamp down and say, look, it's the terrorists and we need a full-on 3,000% security state to protect us. Also, part of this is intimidation of Congress itself. Look at all these threats. Look at all these things that are happening. It's you versus them. It's creating this gulf. And that's an important psychological factor in all of this. Remember what Cynthia McKinney said about the environment on Capitol Hill in the weeks and months following the anthrax attacks back in 2001, 9/11 and the anthrax attacks. It was against Congress people themselves. You're the target. This is all happening to you, so you better start passing, the authorization for use of military force and other things so we can get these terrorists. Because again, these are real human beings who themselves are going through this intimidation process, which, if you go back in my archives and listen to my interview with Graham McQueen about the anthrax deception, I can't remember which interview it was, probably interview 944, but anyway, he specifically points out that part of the anthrax deception was about intimidating Congress so that they would go along with the Patriot Act and authorization for use of military force and all of these things that passed in the wake of that terror attack. So this is what this is about. It's as if, violence against Congress critters is going to solve anything. That's looking at this in precisely the wrong way and having no understanding about what's really happening. It's the string pullers. It's not the shadows on the wall that we should be directing our anger towards.
You're exactly right. Or as maybe James, as the kids would say, you're doing it wrong. Our third and final story is a really interesting one, James. It takes us to an interesting site we've probably never cited before, medicalexpress.com, and that's because the original source from the Times Online is, of course, behind the paywall. But interestingly enough, James, I actually kind of find this to be a more succinct version without a lot of the extra sort of social and politicization of it all. Researchers find IQ scores dropping since the 1970s. A pair of researchers in Norway have found that IQ test scores have been slowly dropping over the past several decades. Prior studies have shown that people grew smarter over the first part of the last century as measured by the intelligence quotient, IQ, a trend that was dubbed the Flynn effect. Various theories have been proposed to explain this apparent brightening of the human mind, such as better nutrition, better healthcare, better education, etc., all factors that might help people grow into smarter adults than they would have otherwise. But now, according to researchers in Norway, that trend has ended. Instead of getting smarter, humans have started getting dumber. The study by the team consisted of analyzing IQ test results from young men entering Norway's national service. That's compulsory military duty. Remember that when people are sort of praising Norway and they've got universal health care and universal basic income. It's like, yeah, they also have military conscription as well. Sidebar. Young men entering Norway's national service during the years 1970 to 2009. In all, 730,000 test results were accounted for. In studying the data, the researchers found that scores declined by an average of 7 points per generation, a clear reversal of tests going back approximately 70 years ago. But it was not all bad news. The researchers also found some differences between family groups, suggesting that some of the decline might be due to environmental factors. But they also suggest that lifestyle changes could account for some of the decline as well, such as changes in the education system and children reading less and playing video games more. Sadly, other researchers found similar results. British team found IQ scores fallen 2.5 to 4.3 points every decade since approximately the end of World War II. This past December, another group from the U.S. found that kids who grew up eating a lot of fish tended to have higher IQs, and they slept better too, which is another factor involved in adult intelligence levels. Notably, children in many countries in the modern era eat very little fish. Now, we will include the half-paywalled story, Dumb and Dumber, Why We're Getting Less Intelligent. That comes from the Times. And the original piece of research we will link you back to, Flynn effect and its reversal are both environmentally caused. Now, James, we can even note a little behind the scenes. I was going to say at the beginning of the episode, IQ scores are dropping like flies, but we noted we should maybe change that to a question. Are IQ scores dropping like flies? And from what we can tell from the research, they are, with dudes in Norway, right?
Exactly. This story and the incredible hype and coverage it's getting, just type it into a Google News search or whatever, and you'll find dozens and dozens of results on all sorts of different sites, and they're hyping this. Oh, IQ scores are dropping. People are getting dumber. This is what's happening to the youth, because this is headline fodder. This is also scientific illiteracy 101. Number one, go to the actual study itself. And, I mean, even note the study's title, Flynn effect and its reversal are both environmentally caused, which should show something about how this isn't about just, young people today are stupid. It's, well, there's something going on here, and it seems to have environmental factors at play. But as you say, this is from a study that's been done, and it's followed, I think, 730,000 IQ tests over several decades of Norwegian men, specifically. So, yes, it's a very specific sample, and in fact the data shows that is not happening worldwide. I'll throw in a link to a meta-analysis that was done in 2014, the Flynn effect, a meta-analysis that shows that up to that point, 2014, it was a global phenomenon of about 3 points rise in IQ per decade. And there was another meta-analysis in 2015, 1 century of global IQ gains, a formal meta-analysis of the Flynn effect. So again, these are global phenomena that are happening in Norway specifically, as well as in, I believe, Britain and a couple of other places. It's been documented there has been an IQ decline in a couple of studies. Now, again, what does this actually mean, and what does this suggest? I find it interesting that article you're quoting from says, it's not all bad news. Guess what, guys? Good news. It's environmental. Well, I'm not sure that is good news, really, because that means we are engineering an environment where people are actually losing IQ because whatever it is, the children are being on their screens all day or whatever it is. So that's not necessarily a good thing. And in fact, it could be an extremely dark thing. For anyone who doesn't know about Rick Nevin or his work on Lucifer curves, the legacy of lead poisoning, showing the incredible correlation between all of these things, delinquency and high crime and everything, and lead, and the lead poisoning that was prevalent because of the high abundance of lead in the environment 50, 60 years ago, that is an incredible instance of this type of thing, where clearly there can be an environmental factor that's very specific and can have a very simple solution that can truly take care of a lot of problems. And if we don't see that, then that is a huge problem. So the question is, well, what environmental factors are playing into this IQ decline in certain parts of certain countries among certain age groups? And there are, 50,000 candidates I'm sure that we could come up with off the top of our head for those environmental factors, and probably all of them play some part in this, right? The other thing to think about here is, again, what is the IQ test testing? And is it accurately capturing what it is that it was capturing about the population a century ago? I mean, the way that these tests are structured and delivered and what they actually measure may be less of a tool for understanding how it is we relate to the world in the current day and age. I mean, there are 1,000 factors that go into that alone, which, to be fair, if you actually read the Times piece, or if you read some of these lengthier pieces about this study, they get into some of that detail and quote psychologists and others talking about, well, this doesn't necessarily mean that. It could just mean that we need to restructure this and blah, blah, blah. But all of that nuance is lost in the headlines. Dumb and Dumber, they're all getting stupid. Why are children so stupid these days? Which, of course, just drives a further wedge through the population. We're divided along race, we're divided along sex, gender, orientation, all of this, and we're divided along generational lines. So now it's fun for the older people to hate on the millennials and the millennials to hate on the boomers that caused all the problems, and it's just another rift amongst the population. Whereas, the fundamental underlying environmental factors that may be playing a part in this are much more important and deserve much more study.
I think it's interesting. We spoke about this just briefly before we started to roll on this, that I find it relates in some ways to most of our causes of death anymore are completely avoidable, and that it could be, again, a sort of environmental factor that, again, maybe there are some changes that perhaps might need to be made. I think, James, we were talking about mentioning ones off the top of our head. One of my favorites in studies to point out for one of my least favorite forms of kind of social and environmental pollution, dryer sheets lower IQ. There's research showing that those stinky, horrible dryer sheets lower IQ in children in which they are used around. So I'll include that in the show notes, and all the other bits that we mention here, James, I like to mention at the end of the shows that I broadcast my own stream Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, MediaMonarchy.com/listen, news, music, memes, and more. James,
you've just shown why East Asians have the highest IQ in the world. We don't have dryers in Japan, so there you go. No IQ loss from those dryer sheets. All right, interesting stuff. James, thanks for 3 great stories. Talk to you again next week.
All right, buddy. Take care.